أهلا ومرحبا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. أنا مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. في الأشهر الأخيرة بقي العالم يراقب بقلق بينما كان مرشحو الرئاسة يناقشون الطريقة التي كانوا يتعاملون بها مع المشاكل العالمية، من الصين إلى أوكرانيا إلى الشرق الأوسط. كما قادت هذه الأماكن بحساب تأثير فوز دونالد ترامب أو كامالا هاريس على مصالحهم وعلاقاتهم مع واشنطن، ولكن ما قاموا به كان أكثر من مجرد مراقبة للود، بل حاولوا التأثير على نتائج الانتخابات الأمريكية عن طريق وسائل إجرامية. وكان أسوأ المخالفين روسيا والصين وإيران وكوريا الشمالية. لقد اختبر بعضهم قوة أمريكا في وقت كانت فيه أمريكا تركز على الداخل، ويعود الهجوم الصاروخي الإيراني على إسرائيل مثلا جيدا. كيف سيكون رد فعل هؤلاء الممثلين السيئين بمجرد انتهاء الانتخابات الأمريكية؟ وكيف ستؤثر النتيجة على سلوكهم؟ هل من المحتمل أن نرى الصراعات تنحصر أم أنه من المحتمل أن نرى المزيد من المغامرة والتنمر خلال الفترة الانتقالية بين الإدارة الحالية وخليفتها؟ لمناقشة التحديات الأمنية في أعقاب الانتخابات الوطنية الأمريكية، يسعدني أن أرحب بفريقنا المؤلف من خبري السياسة الخارجية دينيس روس ووان زراتي. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. A sweep for the Republicans. Donald Trump winning in a landslide, winning the popular vote, something that almost nobody predicted, and Republicans picking up huge seats in the Senate and retaining a majority in the House. Now, this election occurred at a moment of great global uncertainty. Probably not since 1980 has the United States been so deeply engaged in conflicts around the world. During a presidential election, Ukraine, Gaza, Lebanon, and then, of course, tensions in East Asia, horrors of Sudan, terrorism in the Sahel, a moment of great global uncertainty. We're going to connect our election with that uncertainty. I'm delighted to have Juan Zarate and Dennis Ross to help decipher what all this means for America and the world. Gentlemen, immediate reactions as you look at the lens of foreign policy and the impact of our presidential vote. Dennis?
Well, I think it sends a message to the rest of the world, certainly in Europe, of uncertainty, a genuine concern about what a President Trump will mean for the NATO alliance, for the relationship with Europe, his emphasis on applying tariffs across the board. I think there's genuine uncertainty there, concern about what it will mean for Ukraine. I think in the Middle East, it's kind of a kind of interesting mixed message. It's not that there's an expectation that suddenly he wants to become even more active in the Middle East, but there is a perception of him here that his unpredictability makes people, or at least some, think that it will make the Iranians and others more cautious. And they might be more cautious, especially in the aftermath of actually having suffered the kind of setbacks that both Hezbollah and Hamas have, Iran itself. So there's a kind of sense, I think, in the Middle East more generally, that this may not be such a bad thing for their interests and for what the future will hold for the region. I think in Asia, again, I think probably with Japan and South Korea, there are some genuine questions and concerns about Donald Trump and his approach to alliances. He has a way of looking at alliances and assuming that the allies are supposed to be paying us, not we're supposed to be paying them. So I think there'll be a lot of uncertainty, but there's also a lot of thinking about, okay, what's the best way to approach him? Will he be any different than he was during his first term? I think there's probably more questions than answers in most of the rest of the world.
Right. So, Juan, your view, looking through the foreign policy lens?
Rob, the first point I'd make is from a domestic electoral perspective, the fact that the election went off relatively peacefully without major problems or accusations of fraud, these kinds of things, or electoral chaos, which many people feared, was a very good sign. I think the electoral process worked. It obviously represents a red wave, if you will, for the Republicans. But the fear that the sense of American democracy sort of being very brittle, as demonstrated through electoral chaos, didn't transpire, and that was a good thing. And certainly, we didn't see foreign actors able to manipulate, tabulations or anything like that, which were part of nightmare scenarios going into the election. So that's a good thing. The sense of stability of democracy, even if there's uncertainty as to where foreign policy may be heading. I think the Trump administration is going to have to thread certain foreign policy needles. And I think the world is sort of holding its breath. In some ways, Trump is not new, right? The world has experienced the transactional, personal nature of the Trump foreign policy. To Dennis's point, the idea that allies need to be paying more, doing more, certainly providing more value to the United States is going to be part of his foreign policy. There's no question. It's going to be more transactional. How that plays out in the different conflicts and the different issues that are arising around the world and that are persistent, I think are to be seen. I think the biggest question certainly will be in Ukraine. Will Trump and J.D. Vance, his vice presidential candidate, who is aligned with President Trump on these issues, will they begin to withdraw support from Ukraine? Will they weaken the NATO alliance? Will they push Zelensky to accept some negotiated settlement that doesn't benefit Ukraine or European security? Right? Those are big questions that will be immediately put on the table. But I also think that the people he surrounds himself with will again help determine where things go. If he puts in place a Secretary of Defense, a Secretary of State, a National Security Advisor that have in mind the importance of these alliances, that have in mind the need to reestablish deterrence against Iran, against China, certainly against Russia, that have in mind the ability to counter the growing alliance between China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran, that will then shape a different kind of foreign policy, because those cabinet secretaries, those senior leaders in foreign policy will shape the instincts that Trump will have from day to day. And I think, at the end of the day, Trump is going to be mercurial in his foreign policy, which adds uncertainty, which isn't good, but at some point adds to the deterrence value of U.S. power around the world.
Let me ask you, Dennis, you underscored in your opening remark about how our allies would be viewing this with uncertainty and anxiety. How about some of our adversaries? Let's start with Vladimir Putin. How is he waking up this morning?
My guess is that Putin is waking up this morning feeling a whole lot better than he did yesterday. The reason is he has a set of expectations about former President Trump, President-elect Trump. It'll be interesting to see if those expectations prove to be correct. Now, the expectations are based upon the relationship that he had with him when he was president. So he believes that he's much more likely to be responsive to Putin's interests and concerns. He believes that he'll look for a way out of Ukraine to reduce the level of American support, that inevitably he will end up putting more pressure on Zelensky, and that will create a circumstance for him where he might well be open to a negotiation, but it'll be a negotiation that keeps part of Ukraine beyond Crimea, maybe in the Donbass area, as part of Russia, and Russia in a place where it has a kind of continuing Damocles sword that it can hang over the head of the Ukrainians as a way of putting pressure on them not to become a member of NATO, not to become part of the EU. I mean, one of the interesting things that I think Juan said that captures his first term, the more he sees things as this is good for him, this is a win for him, the more he's likely to define that's the right approach to follow. If he perceives that this approach in Ukraine is portrayed as a defeat for him, as a win for Putin, then it might not meet the expectations that Putin has. But certainly, waking up today, I think he feels he has someone in the White House who's prepared to do business with him on terms that are more favorable to him.
Juan, let me ask you about China. There's the critique of Donald Trump is, in one word, isolationist. But on the issue of China, the Republican Party foreign policy establishment is filled with what are called China hawks, people who see the great national security threat to the United States being China, and who actually want want to focus as much of our energy and military power in East Asia as possible to address this strategic challenge. How do you think the Chinese leadership is waking up this morning?
I think the Chinese are likely quite wary. They're probably waking up less comfortable today, as opposed to under the Biden administration. I think there are two reasons. One, President Trump has not been shy at using the White House executive power and policy to confront the Chinese. Some could argue, as you just said, Rob, that the policy environment in Washington, not just from Republicans, but also Democrats, has really caught up to the Trump view of confronting China and maybe even leapfrogged it to a certain extent. There is greater and greater concern about all forms of Chinese influence and threat to the United States. That has also been met, I think, in recent years by other countries recognizing that there is more of a China threat than before in Australia, in Japan, in India, of course, not to mention growing in Europe as well. And so in some ways, the view of the world that Trump was espousing, a very harsh at times use of tariffs, use of sanctions, direct confrontation with China potentially, is now sort of the norm in many ways. And so it will be interesting to see what Trump does, but he has certainly promised the use of tariffs. He has promised to confront China both directly and indirectly. This may have blowback with other allies like Mexico, where President Trump has threatened tariffs on manufacturing in Mexico that's tied to China. So there will be ripple effects to a confrontation with China, but there's certainly going to be tension. And ultimately, there's going to be a question of how far the Trump administration is willing to go to defend Taiwan in the face of Chinese aggression. And I think that's really the bellwether question as to how aggressive the Trump administration is going to be in East Asia. It's the question of the defense of Taiwan.
Indeed. As you point out, on the one hand, the Republican Party is filled with China hawks. On the other hand, the Trump-Vance foreign policy line is no wars on our watch. How you balance this versus vis-a-vis Taiwan is a critical issue.
Yeah, and Rob, to that point, I think the Republican establishment has bemoaned the fact that we've lost the deterrent effect, if you will, with respect to the state competitors, non-state actors. There's a sense that our enemies no longer fear us, and that we need to do more to deter. In some ways, that puts a burden on military assets and other tools of statecraft to try to demonstrate that the U.S. won't be absent. But what are the limits of that? And I think that's one of the conundrums and juxtapositions that the Republicans have to deal with, and certainly the Trump administration will have to grapple with in the coming months.
All right, when we come back after the break, we're going to talk about transition and what might happen over the next 2.5 months under the presidency of the still president, Joe Biden, in just a moment. My guests today include Dennis Ross. Also with us is Juan Zarate. A unique feature of our constitutional system is that our administrations take a long time to change. It'll be 2.5 months, the third week of January, before Donald Trump once again takes the oath of office. Until then, it's still Joe Biden as president. Dennis, if you're Joe Biden and you're not handing the baton to your vice president, Kamala Harris, but to the other guy, what are you going to do on foreign policy in your last 2.5 months?
Certainly, when it comes to Ukraine, he would try to get as much out the door to the Ukrainians in terms of military materiel as possible. Knowing that Trump is coming in, not knowing whether Trump's going to continue to support, he will try to push everything out the Pentagon's door that he can. That's number one. Number two, I think he genuinely wants to see an end to the war here in Gaza. The administration is actually quite close to a ceasefire agreement in Lebanon. I think he wants to see an end to the war in Gaza. And there's an interesting paradox here. I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu understands when President-elect Trump says, I want the war over, and preferably I want the war over before I come in, I think he understands it's probably in his interest to try to see if he can work an understanding with Biden and get some commitments from Biden that could be useful. Bear in mind that the MOU, Memorandum of Understanding, the 10-year Memorandum of Understanding comes to an end. This is what provides for 10 years every year, $3.8 billion worth of military assistance to Israel. That comes to an end in 2026, meaning it has to be negotiated next year. So I could see that the Prime Minister here and President Biden might well want to see if they can create some criteria or principles that will guide that President Trump would inherit, and he might very much approach it from the standpoint of thinking, look, I can't be doing less than what President Biden did. So I suspect there'll be an interest, A, in trying to get this war to come to an end, B, in terms of trying to work out some understandings about how the nature of security assistance to Israel will work over the coming years. Again, one thing about President Trump, he's not exactly someone who is identified with providing large amounts of security assistance to others. Doesn't mean it won't happen, but his going in instinct is typically to do less, not more.
Juan, any thoughts from you about what Joe Biden might do in his last 2.5 months?
I think Dennis is absolutely right. I think there's going to be an acceleration of measures, steps, aid on all the issues that this administration cares about and is worried will not be President Trump's priority. So certainly on Ukraine, certainly trying to end the wars or facilitate the ceasefires in the Middle East, trying to ensure de-escalation wherever possible. And certainly I think the question of whether or not Iran is going to attack Israel and whether or not Israel would respond is going to become a major issue here in the coming weeks. And I think the Biden administration will do everything possible to try to dampen the tensions and to prevent further escalation. The one thing I would note, and you've seen this even during the electoral cycle, the Biden administration has been trying to accelerate lots of policies and regulations and other things that they want to see done before the transition. That's not often the case in prior transitions. Dennis can speak to his remarkable experience through many administrations. I can tell you that when we transitioned from the Bush administration to the Obama administration, once the election happened, there was a pumping of the brakes, so to speak. There was a desire to not push forward with certain policies. You remember the Afghanistan security review, which had frankly been completed before the transition, but it was not published in respect and in honor of the new administration. We had several other policies that were completed by late October, early November, meetings in the Oval Office where we were ready to go. And the president said, it's too late. These are things that the new administration should consider and should be in a position to determine. And so there was a respect for the transition, a respect for the new team coming in, and a recognition that the new team was going to have to handle all of these issues and had to have a say in what would happen next. It's not clear to me that that's necessarily the ethos in the transitions that are happening in recent years.
I'm just going to throw in two Middle East wild cards. One, Joe Biden may still want to get a Saudi-Israel agreement in his waning days, and I wouldn't even take off the table the idea that he views it as a presidential responsibility to address the Iran nuclear issue because he has no confidence that Donald Trump may address it. But before, I want to switch gears because we only have 2 minutes left. Juan, you mentioned earlier about appointments, where Donald Trump may go. In his first term, he went mainstream with his early appointments to try to allay fears about what he might do in foreign policy. Now he's been reelected. He may not have the need to allay fears. It might be Trump being Trump. If it is Trump being Trump, who or what type of people do you think we might expect in senior positions in the national security sphere?
Well, very quickly, this transition that I've witnessed from the outside is much more organized and more professionalized than in 2016. And so 2015, 2016. So that's good news. I think there's less chaos around personnel and people that are being vetted. I think there are two factors here. I think Trump is going to want people who've been incredibly loyal to him through thick and thin through January 6th. So there's a danger that you're going to have sycophants sort of occupying key positions. On the other hand, there are many that have made their political accommodations with President Trump. Think of the Senator Rubios of the world, the establishment Republicans who very much want to be a part of the administration. And I think the president is not only going to have to deal with his own kind of personal desires to have loyalists in place, but also the political necessity to have key people who've been loyal to him politically in key positions. And so I would not be surprised to see a Mike Pompeo come back into a position of relevance, or a Marco Rubio into a position. So you could have a mixture of loyalists and those that appear to be more establishment in the administration. At least that's what I think.
All right. Thank you. Dennis, any thoughts about the people around Donald Trump that we might see in a new administration?
I do think one of the lessons he learned from his first term was not to appoint people who wouldn't do what he wanted, and he would discover only later that they hadn't done what he wanted. I think that means he's going to put people in place who, in fact, he is confident will do what he wants. It may mean you'll still end up with some kind of balance, but I suspect we will have some people who are close to him who he will feel will be watchdogs on how the decisions he's made are actually being carried out. Bear in mind, he feels completely vindicated now. And as someone who feels completely vindicated, he's going to believe, I got elected, I got a mandate, I've been elected to do what I said I was going to do. I think he intends to go ahead and do it and not have people around him who will make that harder.
All right. Thank you both very much. Juan Zarate, Dennis Ross, for joining me so quickly after our presidential vote to help explain to the world, to our Middle East viewers, what this all means for them. Thanks for joining me on Dakhel, Washington. وبهذا تنتهي هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أسئلة أو تعليقات حول هذه البرنامج، وخاصة حول كيفية تغيير السياسة الخارجية في عهد رئيسنا الجديد، أرجو التواصل معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاج Inside Washington أو مباشرة @RobSatloff. نلتقي في الأسبوع المقبل، وحتى ذلك حين شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.